Where do we find the courage to submit to governments when they neglect biblical values? And when is the time to stop obeying men and women so that we can obey God? Join the conversation below in the comment section, letting us know what you think. Should Christians submit to governments no matter what? G'day, I'm Josh, and welcome to Gospel Habitus, where we apply the Bible to everyday life so that you can be transformed by the gospel for real-world cultural influence. In this video, we'll explore 3 principles from Romans 13 about civil obedience for Christians and what that looks like in a post-Christian world. Hang around to the end, and we'll also ask the question as to whether civil disobedience is ever a valid framework for modern Christians. I've put a bunch of online resources in the description if you want to dig deeper, but for now, let's dive into our topic, civil obedience for Christians. We're living in a secular and materialistic culture, and we've got a problem. The people who God has given inherent authority to lead, rule, and govern us, well, they rarely consider God's justice when they're making decisions and writing policies. In fact, their policies and laws are often opposed to Christian biblical values. Euthanasia, abortion, ethics for marriage, or you might be more concerned about human rights around mandatory vaccinations, vaccine passports, and freedom of speech for strong-arm governments. Maybe you feel that religious freedoms are vulnerable at the moment because of recently proposed legislation removing the right or aiming to remove the right for Christian schools and organisations to only hire staff that share the values of the school community. So in this moment, our challenge is this. How do we follow the Bible's command for Christians to live in submission to governments and authorities, especially when they seem so anti-God? Today, I'm leaning on David McDougall's recent sermon at Hurstville Presbyterian Church in Sydney. It was on civil obedience from Romans 13. A link to the audio is in the description. If I was going to sum up his sermon, I'd say that because God has established governments for our good, for the common good of everyone, then our default position has to be one of biblical submission. So, let's look at 3 principles for submitting to our governing authorities, even when it's hard. Number 1, all authority belongs to God, and He establishes governments for the promotion of the common good. He delegates authority according to His will. And this fact is clearly seen not just with our relationship with government, but all of our human relationships. See, God has established a framework of authority that permeates throughout all of our relationships. And this is true of governments as well. And therefore, we need to trust God that they are His tool for our ultimate and eternal good. Number 2, the Christian's default position should be one of submission to the lawful commands of their governments. First, what is biblical submission? Well, I describe it as a willingness to participate in followership with the intent of respecting and supporting appropriate authority. What is it not? Well, it's not blind obedience. Our submission is not based on government performance either. The obvious difficulty comes when people with power abuse it and work against God's intent for human relationships. Even when those with authority are out of sync with God, I believe it's the Christian's responsibility, it's their default position to be in submission and to provide sacrificial service. Sinful and toxic leadership, suppression of liberties, overbearing, strong-arm authorities do not in and of themselves justify civil disobedience. Submission to just and legal authority is expected even if it results in trials, persecutions, and suffering. We need to practice biblical submission that honors Jesus and points to Him. So, how do we even do that? Well, principle number 3 is that the Christian response to government laws and policies must be characterized by doing good in the eyes of the Lord. The Apostle Paul very quickly moves from the topic of submitting to governments in Romans 13 to reminding his audience of the 2 greatest commandments, that you are to love the Lord your God and to love your neighbor as yourself. That, he says, love is fulfilling the law. But what about all those Christian martyrs, I hear you ask? What of the giants of our faith that did in fact disobey evil kings and queens, tyrants, maniacal dictators and immoral governments? And yes, I agree there is a time for civil disobedience. Civil disobedience, that is, conducting criminal activity in the eyes of the government, is reserved for circumstances where there are no longer legal means to obey God. And there's only two reasons that I can see that a Christian should do this. One, that they're commanded to sin by the law, or two, the law prohibits them from obeying God. And I've got to admit, I'm yet to find myself on the wrong side of Australian law for the sake of my faith. I'm hoping to pull together a video specifically on civil disobedience soon, but to be honest, at least as a wider culture, in a general sense, I don't think we're there yet. So what does this all mean? Is there a contemporary issue that you'd consider or that you are considering practicing civil disobedience over? Let me ask you this. Before you get to the point of breaking the law, of conducting something that's considered to be criminal, are you actively seeking to make a change in the area that you feel is being unjustly represented by that said law? Have you exhausted all of your legal options of Christian influence? Because if you're just sitting back, passively waiting for your chance to disobey, if you think that civil disobedience is somehow pop culture and in vogue, then I reckon that's a shame on you. The intersection between faith in Jesus and modern culture doesn't look like the comment sections on 9gag or 4chan or Reddit in the real world. And I think that if you're in that position, if you're looking for chaos and anarchy so that you can bring about change, then you're falling well short of the standards set out in Romans 13 and 1 Peter 2 and Titus. And if that's you, I think you dishonor the countless giants of the faith who actually legally resisted corrupt and evil governments by being a Christ-like presence to their pagan world. They did so up until the point where they could no longer legally obey God. And then many of them bled and died as they submitted to the consequences of the law they were compelled to break in the name of Jesus. So, let's get out there and be a blessing to our city. Let's bring about a gospel change to our world, not because we want to somehow build Christendom, but because we want our actions and our lives to point to Jesus. So firstly, pray. If you're concerned about abortion, go and volunteer at an adoption agency, or financially support a charity that cares for grieving mothers and fathers of aborted children, or become a foster parent. And pray. And if you're bothered by medically assisted dying, then go and give compassion and comfort to those in palliative care. If you're passionate about religious education being taught in public schools, go and teach children the Bible. Sign petitions, join advocacy groups, and pray and engage in public debate. Use social media in a way that is constructive and loving and points people to Jesus with compassion. Legally protest and demonstrate for justice. Write letters to your local member of parliament, sharing your beliefs and your biblical worldview. Don't just criticize culture, but add value to culture by participating in the most honoring parts of it. Finally, please be humble. Consider your own needs as less important than God's gift of governments for our common good. Did I mention that you can pray? Whatever you do it with the intent of fulfilling the greatest commandments, to love the Lord your God and love your neighbor as yourself. And if you do fall on the wrong side of the law for following Jesus, be there because you've done something really, really good for God's people and his eternal kingdom, not just a fading idea of historic Christendom. What do you think? Join the conversation, check out David McDougall's sermon, and explore some resources from the description below. And maybe, this week, find a new way that you can be a blessing to your city so that together we can be transformed by the gospel for a real-world cultural influence. Until next time, peace.